Hi there. I want to welcome you to another session. I'm Michael Diamond, Academic Director of the Integrated Marketing and Communications Program at NYU School of Professional Studies. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Fred Garcia to our conversation, to our community today. Fred is a long-standing member of the NYU community, a really much admired and awarded teacher, not just for us, but for a number of other distinguished institutions and the military. He also is the president of Logos Consulting and an expert, I think, I would be able to say without any qualification, in crisis communications. So absolutely delighted to welcome him and a super all-round guy and wonderful colleague. So Fred, welcome.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
You know, one of the questions that, really fascinates me, especially for people who've had, the breadth of experience, both, geographic, business type, et cetera, as you have had, is what you feel in these times we could learn from the past. You know, what have we seen? What have we experienced? What do we know that we can draw upon?
Well, thank you. And let me begin by saying I've had the good fortune of working in the world of crisis for nearly 40 years, teaching it in your program and others for more than 30 years. And one of the things that I and my firm find when we study crises is they follow predictable patterns. There's predictable patterns of human behavior, which you know from a marketing perspective, but there are also predictable patterns of organizational behavior, of stakeholder behavior when things go wrong. And whether it is a physical crisis, an explosion, a fire, whether it is a crisis of integrity, misconduct, financial malfeasance, whether it's a crisis involving a government or a corporation or a university, the discipline is to never attempt to address the crisis from the perspective of the institution in crisis, but to always address the crisis from the perspective of those who are affected by it. So it's not what does the university need to say, it's what do the students and faculty and staff and community need to experience. And one of the patterns we find is the first need of stakeholders in a crisis is to believe that the institution and its leaders care about them. So whether it's in the aftermath of 9/11, or if it's during the SARS crisis or the MERS crisis or the Ebola crisis, or less intense crises that play out in more tight geographic areas, the first expectation is that the leaders of institutions care, and then they need to operationalize that care in first addressing whatever caused the problem that made it happen in the first place so it doesn't happen again, and then attending to the needs of those who are directly affected and indirectly affected by the crisis. And whether it's something as big as COVID-19 or as small as simple academic misconduct, the demonstration of caring is what gets an institution and its leaders and its stakeholders through the crisis effectively. The more leaders can resist the temptation to make choices out of personal preference and more out of the needs of those who are affected by the crisis, the more effective the crisis response will be.
Do you think, Fred, there's, this word unprecedented has been used a lot, obviously, and it trips off the tongue, but is there something to be said that, that there are no rules, there is no playbook is another phrase you've been hearing, throw out the playbook because
there
this
is a playbook.
Unprecedented.
There is a playbook, but it's not the COVID-19 playbook. So let me give you an example. No one expected, let me raise that. No corporation in Manhattan expected terrorists to fly into the World Trade Center. There was no playbook for Trade Center collapses. I have many clients who were in and around the World Trade Center when it happened. The one who got through it well found the closest available playbook. And that was the playbook for Y2K, which had happened a year and a half before. And the Y2K book assumed that technology didn't work. Our phones don't work, our computers don't work, we don't know where our people are. And there were systems put in place for what to do and how to do it in the event that our phones and computers don't work and we don't know where our people are. And employees were socialized into the playbook long before Y2K. So I have a client, had a client, and it was the commodities exchange on the first floor of the World Trade Center. It's the one that in the movie Trading Places trades frozen concentrated orange juice. And the World Trade Center collapsed right on top of them. But when the plane hit the tower and the power in the phones went out, they knew what they were expected to do. They actually, in anticipation of Y2K, had created a parallel trading floor that they put in Long Island City with its own electrical grid, with its own phone system, with its own technologies. And everybody who worked on or at the commodities exchange walked up First Avenue, crossed the 59th Street Bridge, were in the alternate trading facility by 11 in the morning, ready to keep trading. The Treasury asked them not to, but that particular exchange was able to follow a different playbook and get through it because they found something that was similar to it. There's no playbook for COVID-19, and in some ways it is unprecedented. It's unprecedented in its scale and its scope, and I believe that the COVID-19 crisis is actually 7 different kinds of crises combined. That's what makes it unprecedented. Any one of those we can unravel, and there are playbooks for those. So, for example, at its very basic, COVID-19 is a public health crisis. With all of the manifestations of a public health crisis, we know how to deal with public health crises. This one happens to be bigger than any that we've experienced recently, but we know how to deal with those. The public health crisis has escalated into something unprecedented, and that is medical staff not having sufficient capacity in the hospitals and not sufficient personal protective equipment, lack of adequate testing, lack of sufficient testing, lack of clarity about when to test and whom to test. But at its basic, it's a public health crisis, and leaders need to keep that public health crisis in mind. The second dimension is it's very similar to a typical corporate crisis. There's going to be an effect on revenue. There's going to be an effect on cost. We know that that's already affected NYU in ways that Andy Hamilton has shared. There is operational disruption. There's a need to improvise human resources because we haven't done this kind of thing before, but we have a playbook for dealing with crises at the institutional level. What makes this a bit unprecedented is every institution on the planet is now affected by this, which isn't commonly the case. The third dimension is we have an economic crisis. I have a lot of clients on Wall Street. In January, they were predicting that the likelihood of a recession in 2020 was very low. Now it's a foregone conclusion. And all of the things that come with an economic crisis, including the government trying to essentially shock the system back into health, the central banks trying to create interest rate abilities to borrow money. We see petroleum trading at zero, so they'll pay you to take petroleum off their hands. But the magnitude may be unprecedented, but we know how to deal with economic crises. The fourth dimension of the crisis is we have an information crisis. Even now, 4 months into the crisis, there isn't a common understanding of the transmission, what causes it, how to prevent it. There isn't clarity about whether we should stay at home or we should open up. There isn't clarity about whether we ought to wear what kinds of personal protective gear when we go outside, whether masks help or not. There's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of false information. There's a lot of intentionally misleading information. And there's an information crisis, but we have a playbook on how to deal with information crises. We also have a competence of government crisis. It's not unique to the United States. There was one in China. There was still one in Iran. There were several in Europe, but in the United States, the competence of government crisis is profound. We do not yet have a whole of government response. We have a fragments of government response. Governors are now trying to create something resembling a whole of government response. So in the Northeast, we have 5 states that have gotten together to treat their citizens as one unit. We see the same thing on the West Coast. We see the same thing in other regional clusters where the governors themselves are trying to find ways to do more of a whole of government response. They were bidding against each other for personal protective equipment and for ventilators and things like that. They're still bidding against the federal government. Even in the federal government, there's no clear person in charge. It seems to change every day. And there isn't common guidance the guidance tends to be contradicted throughout different parts of the government and from day to day. So that's the confidence of government crisis. We also have a social crisis, and that social crisis began simply with the difference of having to be in isolation, of not having social contact with each other. We are social creatures, and the idea of sheltering in place is a difficult one. We know that one of the most cruel punishments is solitary confinement, and there's a lot of people now in involuntary solitary confinement, and it's just causing a very difficult time for them. But there's another manifestation of the social crisis, and that is stigma. And we've seen from the very beginning groups being stigmatized. In New York City in February and March, anyone wearing a mask was suddenly suspect. These days, anybody not wearing a mask is suddenly suspect. So the form of the stigma may change. To me, one of the most dangerous stigmas that I've been writing about on social media and preaching about out in public is the labeling of the virus, the China virus, or the Chinese virus. And I began sending up the alarm about that in February and early March when the president kept referring to it this way. The World Health Organization advises against labeling diseases from countries or cities of origin because of the stigma that it places on people. Well, no surprise, there has been, according to the FBI, a wave of hate crimes against people perceived to be Asian or Asian American. And as you know, a significant part of our student population fits that description, and many of them have had really horrible experiences. There was a 9-year-old boy in Texas who was stabbed in the face with a knife, got 11 stitches across the face. His father was also stabbed in the face with a knife. The boy and his father were from Myanmar, but the person who was arrested for stabbing them said that she was protecting Texas from the China virus. We saw an Asian American in Brooklyn had acid thrown on her face by a man who screamed at her about the China virus. And so we need to be diligent in eliminating that stigma and holding leaders accountable for that stigma. The final dimension of the crisis is we have a mental health crisis. We have people who are scared, people who are increasingly depressed. Calls to mental health hotlines have increased by 1,000% this month. We see Governor Cuomo and other governors asking for mental health professionals to volunteer their time, helping people who are coping. As we're exceeding, as of the date that we're recording this, 60,000 Americans dead in 6 weeks, we also have just an unprecedented degree of mourning. We are suffering human loss. We are in mourning. We are scared. We are fragile. And this mental health crisis will only get worse as the crisis moves forward. What is unprecedented is these 7 dimensions coming at the same time. But we know how to deal with mental health crises. We know how to deal with social crises. We know how to deal with confidence of government crises and all of the other dimensions. The discipline of leadership, which I think, for example, Andy Hamilton has done very, very well, is to acknowledge all 7 of those dimensions. Because if we focus on only 1 or 2, we are going to inadvertently cause harm in the other dimensions. That's the leadership challenge. What is unprecedented is the scope and scale, but not the interworkings within each of those dimensions.
Yeah, no, I'm really fascinated by how you dimensionalize that, Fred. And I think that one of the things I've been observing along the way, and certainly observed early on, is in an effort, it seemed to me, almost to ignore or block out these quite deep existential questions that we all suddenly were dealing with. We started to find some comfort, at least, in solving for things that might have, on the face of it, seemed trivial. About how you arrange your desk when you're working at home and things like that. And indeed, some quite well known marketing professors took Harvard Business Review to task, for example, for having an article on working from home. And and I think the point was missed a little bit to what you're saying, is that this was this multi-layered, deep set of crises, including a mental health, or I might term it a sort of consumer psychology crisis. There was something about our own individual psyches that were now disrupted. The word disrupted came up a lot in some research. One of your colleagues, Mark Truss, who heads up, he's the chief of research at Wunderman Thompson, and teaches with us, has done a study, and this word of disruption is a very strong, prevailing sense. So it's a good segue, I think, maybe to some observations about leadership. I mean, you raised the term, and I do want to, partly because, and I should have noted that Fred is the author of at least two wonderful books and a third that's about to come out. Both of his books, The Agony of Decision and The Power of Communications, are well thumbed in my office and taught in our classes. But and he has a new book coming out called The Words on Fire, which you may want to talk about a bit. But let's sort of situate it first in the context of leadership and some of your observations about leadership and the leaders you've observed. I mean, I want to take you back a little bit. Obviously, there's plenty to talk about the current environment, but some of those leaders you serve perhaps as an advisor or you witnessed and you draw upon when you teach and reflect.
So one of the things I do is study the patterns of leadership, and I'm fortunate. I've coached personally 400 CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. I've taught and coached more than a dozen generals in the United States military and admirals in parts of the United States military. One of the places that I teach, as you know, is in the Command and Staff College of the United States Marine Corps, and also in the General Officer Warfighting Program in the Air Force War College and the Defense Information School. I have the opportunity there to watch people who are brilliant leaders doing remarkable things with empathy, which you don't necessarily expect people with stars on their collars and who wear uniforms to express empathy, but they do. And I'll point to a case study in a moment. But one of the patterns we find, whether in civilian life, in academic life, in business life, in religious life, in the military, anywhere there are complex institutions, leaders are judged based on how they deal with their most difficult challenges. And whether it's a CEO like Tony Hayward, who by all accounts, CEO of BP 10 years ago, was a brilliant petroleum engineer, he was unable to express empathy. He kept making decisions based on personal preference. And the BP situation went sour very, very quickly. And his obituary, which I hope doesn't come for a long time, but his obituary is going to begin with a failed response to the Deepwater Horizon. We see that with leaders across sectors. When they mishandle the crisis, that becomes the defining element unless they can find a way to recover. Most don't. Another pattern is we need to acknowledge the hard stuff quickly. And leaders who deny or deflect or diminish the significance of the problem predictably lead their institutions into very bad outcomes. Now, you mentioned one of the books that I've written about crisis and leadership, and that's The Agony of Decision. I document across sectors, one of the most common ineffective responses to a crisis is denial. Whether it was the Roman Catholic Church with child sex abuse, whether it is consumer products that are poisoning people, whether it is saying, oh, this is nothing, it will magically disappear by the end of the month. Leaders who deny will lead their institutions into a far worse circumstance. Winston Churchill famously said, you have to look at the facts because the facts are looking at you. And if we ignore those facts, we're going to get creamed by those facts. The other thing we find is the first task of the leader in the crisis is to care that something has happened that should not have happened, to care that people are affected or potentially affected and need to be protected, to care that some system or process needs to be remedied. But failure to care about the crisis itself and the victims of the crisis is another indication that the crisis will go very badly. My team and I, since January, have been studying leadership communication for all kinds of institutions, whether business institutions, government institutions, or universities, or religious organizations, or NGOs, and we find common patterns of the effective leadership and the ineffective leadership. And we build it down into best practices, 10 ways leaders need to, some of which seem very explicit and shouldn't be a surprise, some of which are a bit counterintuitive. So here are the best practices of effective leadership communication in a COVID-19 environment. The first is begin all communication with a statement of values or belief or intent or purpose. Create the context in the language of leadership. It start with I before we get to the what. And if you look, for example, at the communications coming from Andy Hamilton, the president of NYU, he does that very, very effectively. He always starts every single one of them with a statement of intent or purpose or belief or values. The second is to show you care by expressing empathy for those who are struggling through the crisis. And again, President Hamilton does that very, very well. The third is to be direct, avoid euphemism. And when leaders use euphemism, they tend to either confuse or infuriate. I'll give you one example. 3 years ago this month, a passenger was horribly treated on a United Airlines flight. He ended up getting a concussion, a broken nose, 2 broken teeth, and was unconscious when he was dragged off the plane. The next day, the CEO used euphemism. He apologized for having to reaccommodate the passengers. And that phrase, reaccommodate, infuriated people and it made the crisis far worse. If someone has died of COVID-19, the leader needs to say one of our colleagues has died from COVID-19, not one of our colleagues has suffered an unfortunate medical consequence. That is confusing. You don't know what that means. Mm-hmm. So there's a premium on directness and the avoidance of euphemism. The fourth is tell the truth and tell the whole truth. COVID-19 is going to last for a long time. We need to maintain the trust of those who matter to us, and they need to want to still be in relationship with us at the end. I'll give you an example from COVID-19. I have a daughter who works in fashion event marketing for a high-end retailer in California. She travels in the circle of fashion retail event people from many companies. When all of this started happening a month ago, one of her friends who works at another company was at a corporate meeting, and the question was asked, should we be worried about layoffs? And the person on the stage said, we do not have a plan to lay people off. She took that as a promise that we would not be laid off. She was laid off 3 days later. She felt betrayed. It may be true that on the moment that they spoke, there wasn't a plan, but they were certainly contemplating. The hiding behind the half-truth doesn't help. My daughter was told by her company, we can't promise whether there will be layoffs or not. We can promise that if there are, we'll do everything we can to minimize the impact. She was furloughed a week later. She remains loyal to that company because they did not speak to her in a way that she perceived to be a lie. The literally true statement intended to deceive is just as bad as the lie because it is, in fact, deception. The next best practice is to address all of the relevant dimensions of the crisis. Don't address just 1 or 2 of them because people are experiencing all 7 simultaneously. The next is to remember that expectations are dynamic. What worked yesterday may not work today. You recall there was a time about 6 weeks ago when it was still an open question whether we ought to go to large gatherings. Well, then South by Southwest said, we're going to continue to have the conference. There were petitions by people who were registered for South by Southwest who said, please cancel the conference. And they said, no, we're going to go forward with it. The mayor of Austin made the decision for them. He canceled the conference. 3 days later, the NBA canceled their season, then March Madness canceled, then the Hockey League canceled, and then Governor Cuomo shut down Broadway shows. In 1 week, we went from large conferences are okay to any gathering of people more than 50 is not okay. Now we need to be 6 feet apart and we need to wear masks. We don't know what the expectation will be in a week. So it's important that we calibrate our decision-making to the actual expectations that are valid today. The next is to communicate at multiple levels. Human beings need multiple touch points. So let's use NYU as the example. President Hamilton communicates, so does the provost, so does the dean, so does the head of security, so do you, so does the technology team that's trying to make sure that we know how to use Zoom. We have multiple touch points. That's a best practice. The next best practice is align those multiple touch points at the level of values, even as the factual, tactical communication is relevant to the altitude of the sender. But the values, purpose, belief, intent need to be aligned across multiple levels. The ninth is the leader needs to convey a positive attitude even in adversity, and needs to strike the right balance between conveying urgency and provoking panic. And then finally, the last. Effective leaders express emotion. They allow themselves to be vulnerable. They carry themselves with humility. It's okay to say, I'm scared too. It's okay to say, I don't know precisely what will happen next. Arrogance makes empathy impossible. And it's empathy that's going to get us through this. As I look out on leaders, the best example I have seen is an example from early March by Arne Sorensen. That's A-R-N-E, Sorensen with an O at the end. He is the CEO of Marriott International. I have no particular reason to praise Marriott. I happen to be a Hilton Diamond member. So I don't stay at Marriott's unless there's nothing else there, not because they're not a great hotel company. I just happen to be with the other guys. But Arne Sorensen, the CEO of Marriott International, gave a talk to his worldwide hotel employees, and he embedded all 10 of these in his talk. He was vulnerable, he was direct, he was empathetic, he told the truth. It was a hard truth. He found the balance between urgency and not provoking panic. He expressed vulnerability. At the end, he literally teared up and choked up, talking about how this would affect the associates at his hotel. He had also just finished a round of chemotherapy, so he himself is in a high-risk group. And he acknowledged that he himself is in a high-risk group. All of those in a pre-COVID-19 environment may not have worked, may not have been the right tone, but he was able to get that right tone. You can find his video on YouTube. I've taught it to my NYU classes. I show it when I speak at conferences. That's a model of effective leadership communication in a COVID-19 world.
Yeah, we'll definitely link out to that. I think that's a fabulous example. You know, one of the, and obviously many of these 10 are things that you have been talking about for many years and probably had codified to some extent already. What I found interesting about most recent times, and I wonder if you can comment, is that some of the 10 that you've described that might be less typically acceptable of your classic leader in the sort of style that you imagine someone to be, like this issue about being vulnerable, or
That's right.
I think in a way this situation has almost demanded that of leaders in a way that prior situations didn't afford them the opportunity. So, and I would say, for example, that there is a liberty, if that's the right word, that leaders appear to have to be able to say, it's an incredibly complex situation. We don't have all the answers. And, I would observe that in many prior situations, certainly going back to the 7 different crises, some of those crises historically, business crises, even to some extent economic crises, was one expected the leader to have the answer, and there's an old joke, we won't tell about the 3 envelopes, etc. But you were supposed to have the answer. It seems to me, and I'd be interested in your observations, that leaders are being given credit, certainly, but it's certainly not being criticized for being open about the fact that it's a very fluid situation. A decision we make today may be different tomorrow, etc.
One of the things we find that is different in this kind of crisis than in other crises is all of us are human beings, and all human beings are equally vulnerable and fragile right now. So this is an instance where it's okay for the boss to say, I really don't know what's going to happen next, because no one really knows what's going to happen next. Whereas if it's a corporation and they've discovered financial malfeasance, we expect the boss to know what's going to happen next, because the boss has control in that environment. Even if the boss doesn't have complete control, the boss at least has control over what to do next. In this circumstance, we are really being driven by what the government tells us. We're being driven by what public health authorities tell us. We're being driven by what is happening to the people who matter to us. If we are a small company in the middle of the country, we may not yet have experienced fully what's happening on either of the coasts, but eventually it will. And so they can learn from us. But one of the things we find is, in this circumstance, vulnerability is appropriate. Humility is always essential, but that humility doesn't necessarily always mean that in other kinds of crises, we ought to express our vulnerability. But in this particular one, we actually are all capable of contracting the disease. We are all at the mercy of what governments tell us, of how the pandemic plays out. And one of the things we teach in our planning segments in the crisis course I teach in your program is no plan survives its initial implementation. And as you begin to implement the plan, people are reacting to it, circumstances are changing, and we have to have clarity about the desired outcome so that we can adapt in the moment and continue making progress towards the desired outcome. In this instance, we have no control over when the desired outcome is likely to happen because of the science, because the pandemic is going to do what the pandemic does, because of public policy. The government is going to do or not do what the government is going to do or not do, and that will have a profound effect on how this plays out. It already has had a profound effect up until this point. Those are outside our control. So any CEO who says we will be shipping product by the first week in June doesn't know what he or she is talking about. That may be an intent, but we don't have the control over that. We don't have the control over our supply chain. We don't have the control over the distribution channel. We have no idea whether there will be a distribution channel in June. I hope there will be. But things are evolving so quickly that we as individual leaders just don't have that control.
It would suggest perhaps, though, that there is a whole new type of leadership that has to emerge. Yes, I mean, we're perhaps have heard the phrase, getting comfortable with discomfort, but it still seems to me it's a somewhat marginal phrase when you think about a set of leadership competencies. But the recent events would suggest that it might be one of the greatest strengths of leaders and organizations more generally, perhaps.
Leaders need to know how to keep people focused on what matters, even in a very difficult and changing environment. The manner in which they do that is as much an art as a science, but the best leaders keep people believing that we're all on the same side. To the degree that leaders are trying to extract individual privilege for themselves, that will alienate the people they lead. One of the things that I've been frankly comforted by, not astounded by, is the number of CEOs that I've interacted with in the last month who are in their kitchen at home and not in some office and not in some luxury hotel, but they're sheltering in place just as we are. And when I have meetings with clients and their senior leadership team, they're all wearing sweaters, and I have no idea whether they're wearing sweatpants where we can't see them, or even whether they're wearing pants at all. But they are sheltering in place just like everybody else. And this is one of those crises where there's a leveling, where there's no real difference in how the crisis is affecting the people who run organizations and the people in the organizations that they run, other than perhaps greater availability of resources. But that's a difference in degree, not in kind. And typically in crises, we still see the people at the top of the pyramid still at the top of the pyramid behaving the way people at the top of the pyramid do, even as they're caring for people below the pyramid. Here we're flat. Everyone is sheltering in place. Everyone is at equal risk of contracting the disease.
I guess I'd argue the rub with you on that a little bit, yeah. Fred. I think when you're looking at 10 to 20 million people unemployed,
I'll grant that.
I think clearly and the data will show in the fullness of time whether indeed the disease hit different types of populations in different ways, and one would have to assume if the disease is transmissible in the way we think it is, then obviously people living in closer proximity to each other are probably more likely to catch the disease. And those who've been required to work, and attend indeed as the frontline employees have to patients who have the disease. So, I'm not
I'll
sure
grant all of that.
necessarily.
I don't disagree with that. But the CEO is still sheltering in place.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair, but I think their experiences of sheltering in place may vary considerably. I mean, again, even if true, which I believe it to be, the issues of empathy, etc., are definitely relevant there. Yeah, it's a very. I mean, as you were talking, I wrote down the phrase "a very human crisis." I mean, it certainly. I mean, one of the things I thought might be actually an interesting article is what I'd call beards and baking, because it surprised me, how many people, obviously men have grown beards who would have eschewed a beard their whole life, and stories of baking and it runs on yeast. Apparently, yeast is one of the products that's very hard to get. But there's obviously some interesting psychology, and I want to switch gears a little bit, see if we can talk a bit about the future. And there's a whole host of subjects we could cover. The general question I've been asking people is sort of to some extent to use a crystal ball and say, what do we think's changed? There's lots of articles saying, oh, there's no going back, and then you fill in the gap, ... I don't necessarily think that question is fair anymore, because neither of us have a crystal ball. But I am interested in exploring some of those areas, either trends you see or things you think we should pay attention to. In terms of individual leadership, skill sets, how brands are responding in a communication sphere, or whatever sphere you like.
One of the things that the COVID-19 crisis does is it intensifies and accelerates trends that we already saw. So for example, I published about 9 years ago a blog that said, there's a fundamental shift in the way we think about work. Work used to be a place you go, now it's a thing you do. Now we're all at work, at home. And I think that is going to profoundly change people's understanding of what it means to work at home. There are some companies where somebody who was working from home was thought to be goofing off. There are some companies where they didn't allow employees to work from home, even though there was no physical reason for them to be physically present. I think this changes that understanding. And it may not be that everyone continues to shelter in place when there's no longer a need to, but I think the definition of what it means to be at work is changing. I see the same thing in an academic environment. So let me just confess. I have been invited to do online teaching for 10 years, and I've said no every single time. Well, now I've been teaching by Zoom for weeks now, and doing client work by Zoom and doing speeches to conferences that are being participated in remotely by Zoom or by GoToMeeting or by Microsoft Teams or what have you. I'm going to be a lot more open-minded about invitations to teach online going forward, because now I see that we can actually connect with students online in ways I never imagined was possible. Another change is, I think there is an opportunity here for us to intentionally model kindness. Be kind to the cashier at the supermarket. Be kind to the postal worker. Be kind to the person who comes by and delivers your food. My guess is we're going to have a greater appreciation for people who were anonymous in our lives before. That when we're able to go out and go to the supermarket, we will think differently of supermarket workers because they are among the essential people who kept us going. We will be more gracious to the people who deliver our mail, more gracious to the people who deliver our food than might otherwise have been the case. We've always admired healthcare workers. They're always at the top of the trust barometer. But it's the people who we didn't fully previously appreciate in deeply essential jobs that are putting themselves on the line to keep us going. I think we're going to have a greater appreciation for the otherwise anonymous people that we've been dealing with in just going out and about in the world. the subway driver, the police officer walking down the street, the Uber driver. Suddenly they are doing what is interpreted to be heroic stuff. And they may not have a choice, some of them, but we now need to model kindness. And I think that modeling of kindness, creating some kind of cognitive dissonance in us, is going to require us to behave kindly, even after the crisis has gone past.
And what's your thoughts about, I mean, I love this idea of intensifying and accelerating. And I've been in conversations where those terms are used often in the context of discussions around innovation, for example. Yeah. So coming out of this, so I think the question, and obviously the question is incredibly pertinent for education, among many other industries, is with 100% effectively of the student body across the country now learning online, and their teachers and students using tools that they may not have used before, modalities, doing classes at different times, all the sorts of things that we have entered a new world that it is hard to see how we'd come back from, but more importantly, has presented opportunities to innovate and to improve. Do you see companies already actively trying to harness some of these insights? Is it too early? What would a best practice company in the area of communications look like, do you think, in that space?
One of the things that I've noticed with many of my clients, but also companies in general, is that the resilient ones were able to pivot and surge, contributing to the resolution of the healthcare crisis, the public health crisis. So I have companies that are in the industrial space who suddenly are surging the manufacture of ventilators and of antibody tests and of masks and of swabs and of gowns. And they were never directly in that business, but they were in parallel or tangential businesses. And now they've been able to pivot on a dime. They're going to make money from it, but they're also contributing to, and my guess is when it's done, they will have a capacity that they didn't have before, and that will probably become a permanent part of their organizations. I also see companies that are thinking differently about HR, thinking differently about how they empower and supervise and motivate employees. And my guess is that innovation, that by necessity way of dealing with employees, will be reflected going forward in the human resource policies of the organizations. I also see different ways to collaborate, and we've been forced to collaborate differently. My guess is we will be even more creative in collaboration going forward. The sharing of documents, the sharing of calendars, the sharing of other things, I've always resisted. I said, no, I don't want you to know what I'm doing on my calendar. I don't want my calendar to be public. Now I've gotten used to my calendar being public among all members of my team. I've gotten used to editing documents without sending emails. I'm an old school guy. I'm over 60 years old. When I started in public relations 40 years ago, we wrote press releases with a fountain pen on a yellow pad. And I've been a late adopter to technologies. I now embrace those technologies because that's what's making it possible for us to do this. Just as I've come to find that we can teach our students in meaningful ways through this technology, I was not a believer before March. I have become a believer now. I'm not alone. So the way that we define being in relationship with each other now, I think, is going to be different going forward long after the crisis has passed.
Yeah, I mean, you've got a few hopeful notes and tones, I think, in your worldview, and I would love to believe you're right. I'll leave it at that in terms of commenting. But I do want to ask a couple of questions because I think you have written about some of these things, or at least aspects. I'm quite interested in your perspective on our thinking about experts and the role expert and expert opinion plays. And obviously that is quite germane to some aspects of communications around thought leadership, etc. One telling of the tale would say we're going to step back and all say, boy, we need to listen to those scientists and we need to pay attention because they were trying to tell us this, several years ago. And I'm mindful, I just watched, I think it was a 2012 or 2014 speech by the head of the World Bank, essentially saying, this was coming, we need to be prepared. But so one telling of the tale says, we should have listened. The other says, oh, those experts, they were so cautious and conservative, and they took us down rabbit holes we didn't need to get into, or, so, I don't want to characterize those points of view any further, but do you think we'll emerge from this with a greater sense of respect for expertise and facts, or is something sort of hard-coded in us to ignore them at our peril?
I think that the idea of intensifies and accelerates applies in the public view of expertise in general. In my next book, I write about anti-intellectualism in American history. Going all the way back to the 1800s and before, there was actually a political party known as the Know Nothing Party that distrusted intellectualism. Today, we see a polarization in American society that includes denial of science, mistrust of science, denial of expertise. The coastal elites who are driven by facts and science are deeply suspect by many people who consider themselves otherwise. I'm not convinced that there will be a wholesale shift of those who mistrust science to trust science, who mistrust expertise to trust expertise, but those who were previously inclined are more likely to go farther in one direction. Those who are just dead set against intellectualism will remain dead set against intellectualism. They may perhaps get a little neutral. My guess is more likely they're going to go in the other extreme, because that's how human beings behave. But one of the things that emerges is those whose profession is to understand these things were sounding the alarm. Even smart lay people. Bill Gates predicted a global pandemic that would affect millions of people 7 years ago. And he sounded the alarm, and he began the Gates Foundation focus on the infrastructure of healthcare to deal with pandemics. The World Bank president predicted this. The American intelligence community predicted this. There was a pandemic playbook written 4 years ago and handed off to this administration and ignored, because, and I don't want to make this political, but leaders in this administration came to Washington with a deep distrust of Washington. And as a result, they didn't accept the wisdom that came from people whose lives have been spent preparing institutions to deal with this. So yes, there's a spotlight on the expertise, but we need only look, for example, at the daily press briefing out of the White House, where you've got a guy who denies science and is mercurial, and then Dr. Fauci, who comes in and in the presence of the guy denying it says, oh no, we're not going to be opened up anytime soon. Oh no, we're still going to have this in September. Oh no, we still need to shelter in place. And the scientists are calling it, and what they predict comes true. And the politicians who deny science are calling it, and what they predict doesn't come true. In fact, it leads to worse consequences. So I think this idea of expertise, those who don't trust experts are not going to be convinced simply because the experts are right. They'll find a way to rationalize it away. It's a process called motivated reasoning, and I write about it in my next book. But those who were previously neutral may be more inclined to trust science. Those who were previously said, of course we trust science, now may have a greater and deeper appreciation of what that means and why we need to promote that. But I don't think that there's going to be a wholesale shift from people who are suspicious to becoming supporters. Sadly.
And maybe even some deeper polarization.
Those who are more likely to go to harden their position. There's an NYU professor named Jonathan Haidt. He teaches at the Stern School, and he's a scholar of morality and public psychology. And he says people will identify with a group and then make decisions that are contrary to their own best interests because they root for the home team no matter who that home team is. And they are immune to persuasion. The only way to move them is to come up with some bigger frame, but I don't see the bigger frame that we have right now. We're all in this together. Isn't a big enough frame.
Right. No, I think that's sort of at the heart of some of the questions I'm most interested in is, how profound a change might we witness to some of these aspects of human psychology, and it's obviously very hard to believe that consumer behavior will change that rapidly, or certainly human psychology. It's taken thousands of years, if not millennia, to frame and form. I want to sort of switch gears to something perhaps in some senses a bit more mundane, but certainly as urgent and important for our students, which is about sort of navigating, a career as an emerging professional, a young professional at these times, and focus perhaps a little bit on what you think are some of the skill sets and capabilities, or even in personal investments young people can make right now to help better position themselves for what is obviously going to be quite a tough employment situation and an economy generally.
So I mentioned before, I have a daughter, 25 years old, who works in special events, fashion, retailing at a high-end retailer in California. She's convinced that retailing is not going to be back the way it was. So in the month that she's been furloughed, she has taken 2 online graduate certificates, regrettably not in our institution, but at a different institution. But she got a graduate certificate in digital marketing, and then she got a graduate certificate in corporate communication. And she is rebranding herself from being a fashion events person to being a digital marketing and corporate communication person, not because her dad is in that business, because I have no understanding of the fashion side of that, but she has invested in her own development. This is an opportunity for our students to continue to invest in their own development beyond the coursework, beyond the degree program. This is the time to take the master classes that are available online. This is the time to learn a new skill. This is a time to learn something deep. For as long as I've been on the NYU faculty, which is, I'm starting my 33rd year in a few months, I've advised students who want to go into corporate communication or public relations to learn how to learn quickly about a whole bunch of things. So read voraciously, be curious about the way the world works, dip into different disciplines so that you can become conversant in them, but then find one thing that's really difficult and become an expert at it. Doesn't matter what it is. So I hired an NYU student to be my crisis simulation person, and her degree from NYU was in art history. And why did I choose her? Number one, she's a great person, and number two, she's really smart and really kind. But I knew that in art history, she had a capacity for research on things that were otherwise obscure and find a way to bring those obscure things to life. She's become a brilliant crisis researcher and now teaches in our program as a guest. She's on the faculty of another institution in New York City. She works with clients. She's 3 years out of school, but I detected in her a curiosity about how the world works and a deep expertise on one thing that is hard. It happened to be art history. It could easily have been cold temperature physics. It could easily have been psychology. It could easily have been the Russian language. What differentiates people in the marketplace is they can pivot into a new industry, a new sector, a new technology, a new culture quickly, and they've learned how to learn deeply. And the more we can build those capacities in our students, I know in the public relations program, there are courses on business acumen. That's critically important. They need to be more than communicators. They need to be more than marketers. They need to be able to learn quickly about things they never heard of before. And I find myself in my firm, on any given day, I'm working with biotech, I'm working with food distribution, I'm working with a university that has a need to figure out how to tell students the bad news that commencement is canceled. All of these are disparate things, and we need to be able to quickly put ourselves in the mindset of a different universe of people very quickly. That only comes from having broad understanding with the ability to go deep where necessary.
Yeah, my sense underpinning both of those things is intellectual curiosity. And I think part of our mission as educators is to enable that, facilitate it, or draw it out. And perhaps the great debate is whether that it's an innate skill or an innate orientation, or it is in fact something that can be nourished and developed. But this encouraging our students to stay open-minded and intellectually curious about the world around them. In fact, it's almost the opposite advice that you might give, which is, find a path and follow a path. It's actually, we're saying to people, the words, there's a playwright, and I'm going to blank on the quote here, but she talks about welcoming the unbidden, so the things
Sure.
in your life which you never actually thought to invite in or expected to encounter. To me, that's one of the lessons we're drawing from this experience, that
Right.
these were unbidden. These weren't things we wanted, but there's still opportunity to learn from them and to and to draw some wisdom or some level of engagement from them. So
Right. All but two of the people who work in my firm are NYU graduates.
right.
Most of them were my graduate students in your program, and I
Mm-hmm.
was their capstone advisor. And one of the things that I look for in the people I hire is the ability to take something that they never knew anything about and to become expert in it quickly. So
Right.
I have employees who come to me and say, I want to go to this neuroscience conference in Silicon Valley and understand the relationship between neuroscience and technology. I said, great, go. I'll pay for it. I had another who came in and said, I want to study the Chartered Financial Analyst course, not to be a financial analyst, but to better understand our Wall Street clients. I said, great, go. And it is that desire to learn deeply for the sake of being able to apply it in other domains, not to become a financial analyst, not to become a neuroscientist, not to become a technologist, but to be able to roll with the changes in the environment that matter to our clients. And the more we can create people who simultaneously have expertise and the ability to adapt, the better service we're doing to our clients. I know that many of our faculty are intentional about doing that. And yes, they need to be expert in the discipline they're getting a degree in. That's table stakes. They need more than that to differentiate themselves in the marketplace.
Well, I think that's a wonderful point to stop. And I very much appreciate the time together. As always, a wonderful conversation full of real insight, wisdom, and very, very practical and applied, which I think is a hallmark of our school as well. So I want to thank you on behalf of the whole community for participating in this conversation today. So
Thank you,
many
Michael.
thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.